Well, I've managed to catch up with John Quelch, who's one of the leading business academics of our generation. John was one of the senior team at leading the London Business School, an associate dean and part of the management team of Harvard Business School, and has recently been appointed the dean of the China-Europe International Business School. John, very nice to see you. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we'll get to talking specifically about China a little bit later on, but let's take a pull back and look at something from a global perspective. In relation to brands and the reframing of the global economy, what role do brands now have in reframing the global economy?
David, certainly during the recession, brands were very important because when you have a downturn, you have a lot of people who are nervous, concerned, less adventurous than when times are good. What that typically means is that they gravitate towards brands which they know and trust. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't also try out private label or store brand substitutes, especially if they are known store brands. But generally speaking, people aren't very adventurous during recessions. When times get better, when the recession turns around, people start getting a little bit more adventurous again. So they will, of course, rely still heavily on trusted, known brand names, but it's an opportunity for new brands, either totally new to market brands or new brands under the umbrella of well-known brands, to start to have a go again and see if they can win some trial from consumers.
So you see trust, in a sense, being a cornerstone of brands in the future as well as they've been in the past?
I think that's always been the case. A brand is a very convenient, simple reference point for a consumer to make their purchase decision-making that much more efficient. Instead of doing a micro-analysis of every alternative in the marketplace for a particular product, they can latch on to a trusted brand and rely on that to deliver a level of quality or price value that is commensurate with what they assume to be associated with that brand name.
Now, you were recently at Davos, and one of the themes of Davos was sort of the new reality. Is there a new reality in relation to brands, or is it a continuation of the old reality?
I think it's a continuation of the old reality. The new reality issue relates to whether or not, after such a long and deep recession, consumers have developed adjusting mechanisms or coping mechanisms that then become ingrained and which continue after the recession is ended. You know, a simple example would be, say you've been used to changing your car out every 3 years for a new car. The recession forced you to continue to hold that car for a fourth, maybe a fifth year. You actually discovered that the car still worked and that your neighbors didn't think any less of you because you had a 5-year-old car parked in the driveway. So as a result of that, maybe your car purchase behavior will shift permanently, or maybe it will be flipped back to buying every 3 years. And that's really what's not quite known at the moment, David, as to whether or not people are going to continue with the coping mechanisms they developed, or whether or not they're going to flip back to their original consumption-driven behavior.
And I think we're already seeing that there are certain categories that people have shifted back relatively quickly, and there are certain categories that it's clearly going to take a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah, I think one of the things to understand is that there are some underlying trends that predated the recession, were perhaps accelerated by the recession, and which are continuing, and that is that there is a percentage of consumers, typically older, but also some younger consumers, who are consuming less than their income level would suggest that they should. These are people we call simplifiers. They are people who are not interested in accumulating product or material goods. Rather, they are interested in spending disposable income on experiences. And I think that that is a more fundamental shift in the economies of developed countries that we're still going to see develop and accelerate further.
Brands used to be controlled by what I suppose now we'll have looked at from a historical perspective, brand managers. They had all the various different levers, and the content and the creation was generated by them. Again, in a more web-centric world where content is being generated by the users, do you see this as being a great advantage for brands or a great detriment to brands?
I think it really depends a little bit on what the positioning and the value system is of the brand. So what you're talking about, user-generated content, engagement and empowerment of consumers, if the brand proposition is consistent with letting control be placed in the hands of the consumer, then it can be a great advantage.
So all this user-generated content could, in effect, actually end up increasing a brand's overall financial value?
Absolutely. I mean, if you can engage with the consumer successfully. Another key point is that if your brand is a social brand, then all of this evolution of content on the internet via Facebook, Twitter, and so on, social networking advantages brands that are social in their core value.
So as older, more established brands start to look and reevaluate what their brand makeup is in a new environment, looking at translating that brand into a more social relationship with their customer base is going to become more important.
If they can make that transition, it's going to be very much a change or die situation for a number of those brands.
Well, we've seen a number of changes over the last 6 years that the Brands EWPP Most Valuable Brand Study has been in existence. In the first year there, I think there were probably one, maybe two brands from China. Technology certainly didn't consume the top places in the brands. Looking forward, maybe for the next sort of 10 years in the Quelch crystal ball, what do you think the shape of those top most valuable brands is likely to be, given the way in which the world and the world's economies are changing fast?
Brands that have a strong social dimension to their value proposition, brands that are more experiential rather than simply delivering a product to a consumer, brands that are developing a technology-based value-added proposition that translates into some lifestyle benefit, as evidenced in Apple. Those are the brands I think we'll see coming more and more to the fore.
What do you think the developed markets, and I think what we can now categorise as the slow growth markets, can actually be learning from those high growth markets of China and India and Brazil and Russia?
In some cases, those markets have, of course, leapfrogged technologies that we have iteratively adopted in the West. And so I think it's been long the case that when it comes to mobile communications, for example, companies in the West have been saying, you know, we need to do a focus group in Shanghai to understand what actually may be the next wave of activity in Europe and North America. And certainly if you take the advent and adoption of SMS text messaging, that would be one prime example. But I think that it's also worth bearing in mind that in these emerging BRIC markets, the domestic market size is so large and expanding so rapidly that many brands, domestic brands, are not necessarily incented at this point to go outside the domestic market. So there are many very strong Chinese brands that have tremendous headroom for growth within China, not necessarily motivated at this stage to go global or international. As a result, they are very much adapted to and focused on adapting to the needs of the domestic market. So some multinational companies competing in the same sectors are going to clearly be able to learn from them in terms of how to do better business in that individual market.
Well, John, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's always very insightful having your observations on what's going on in the world. John Quelch, the Dean of the China Europe International Business School, thank you very much indeed.